Hi, everybody. I'm Tamara Zoner.
And I'm John Davis.
Welcome to Spirit Cafe.
Come in, sit down, and
grab a cup of love.
A Spirituality Without the Guilt podcast. Hey, guys, it's John Davis, and I am really excited today. In my life, I've met people who I instantly feel a connection with, somebody who I just instantly just feel like I can blurt out all of my life stories to. And I am one of the luckiest men on earth today because I get to talk to two of them at the same time, which is the greatest thing ever. So before I introduce our guest who I had on my Interaction Hero podcast a while ago, I first want to introduce my co-host in crime, the lovely Tamara Zoner. Hello, Tamara Zoner. How are you today?
Hello, John. Thank you for such a warm welcome. And I'm great. How are you?
I am doing wonderful. I've been so excited about today because Justin, when he was on my Interaction Hero podcast, Justin was one of those people that I was like, oh wow, I totally get this. We just kind of like we're in sync, and so I thought this is the perfect guest to have on Spirit Cafe. And I'm really curious to see how you guys get along because I think you guys are going to just love each other to death. So are you ready for me to introduce this guy?
Let's do it.
All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very excited. Today, our guest is Justin Caffrey. He when you look at his bio, it's very interesting. Basically, it's from capitalism to Buddhism and everything in between. And he had some great, he's had some big stories that were traumatic that led him down a very different path. And he ended up coming to a place of real spirituality, which I'm just fascinated with. So hello, Justin. How are you? And thank you for being here today.
Thanks, John. Hi, Tamara. Lovely to meet you. Thanks for having me on. And it's great to be back in conversation again.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So Justin, why don't you tell us and Tamara a little bit of your story so she can catch up a little bit here on some of the stuff that I already know.
Sure. Thanks. I think it was a good opening in terms of, my journey, capitalism to Buddhism. And, over the course of 25 years, I started out in London in finance and banking when I was 19. I had a pretty fast accelerator career in the world of banking, very successful at a very young age. And by the time I was like 22 or 23, I was probably making $300,000 or $400,000 a year. And it was a crazy existence where I really felt that the way that I would find personal fulfillment was how other people would perceive me. So, my success was never driven by money or material gain. That was never really part of my ideas. But I really felt that the power to feel self-worth is driven by how other people perceive you. And capitalism is such a fantastic tool for that because, you're either winning or you're losing. There's not really a lot of gray areas. So I was very driven, very motivated, very determined. And at that time, when I started out in my career, I was I wouldn't say I was spiritual or religious. I wouldn't say I was an atheist. I definitely felt that there was something bigger than all of us. But I definitely dispensed the idea of what that needed to be. I wasn't really particularly interested in how or what I needed to do to maintain any sense of spirituality or soul. And I think the pain that I encountered as a young child growing up in difficult circumstances, I had morphed that pain into a power where I knew that I needed to kind of seize control of my environment myself, build a world around me that I felt I could control. But ironically, within that, what I didn't realize was that I was actually giving control to everybody else because my own sense of purpose was really defined by how people perceive me. And that led me to 20 years of huge successes and building businesses and working in private equity and working in investment banking. But within that, feeling a deep sense of pain and frustration, because I didn't really have a particularly good sense of how or what was happening to me in terms of people in my family, people around me in a societal sense, or people who I would want to feel closeness. So I often think back to my 20s, and I just feel there was a period where it was just work. It was no connection. There was no soul. There was limited emotion. And yeah, sure, I had fantastic financial gain. I had cars, houses, all that kind of stuff. But it was only when I met my wife when I was 30 that I realized that there was something more to life than just pushing and hoping that people would feed you back that sense of appreciation, which is completely vacuous. And, they only want to be around you then because of this perceived success. So I was definitely poor of soul and broken in spirit. And I didn't quite realize that. But it was when I met my wife and we had a family, and we had our first child, that I started to have a sense of the importance of something outside of what I needed people to see me doing. But I still hadn't figured it out properly. And then the big kind of kick in the pants moment for me came that when we meant to have our second child, we had 3 miscarriages in the lead up to our second child, which was hugely challenging. But we then finally had our second child, and he was born prematurely, and he had a very challenging life, which lasted 11 months. And then Joshua died. And that reorientated my view on the world completely. And all of a sudden, I felt that my view on how people were going to enrich me in terms of their acceptance was completely irrelevant, because the pain that I felt now was my own, and it was not something that anybody else could help me with. I needed to work on that all by myself.
Wow. Amazing story. So Tamara, did that just hit you in a parental way?
Obviously, yes, because I'm a mom. I have 3 kids and can't even imagine the pain that you experienced.
It's amazing
Thanks.
to me. It's amazing to me how you were originally defining yourself by outer appearances and what other people thought of you, and how your son Joshua literally brought you back to yourself in a way. Is that how you see it, Justin?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, in terms of my own spiritual path, and, I've since Joshua's death, I've worked with some incredible teachers in the realm of spirituality, in Buddhism, in Shigendo, and I've been very lucky. But the greatest teacher in my entire life was an 11-month-old child, who, without Joshua arriving into our world and turning it upside down, and Tamara, to put it more into perspective, we were on vacation in Spain for a week when Joshua arrived, and we were living in the UK at this time, and we never got to leave Spain for 11 months. So he was so ill and in neonatal intensive care and had huge challenges that we were there the whole time, desperately trying to get him well enough to fly him back by air ambulance. So our whole life stopped, and I got a chance to focus on being a dad to both of my sons, and a time to focus on being there for my wife and being a supportive team with each other during this hugely challenging period. And Joshua allowed me to reorientate and understand values far greater. And without his intervention, I think my marriage probably would have eventually fallen apart. And I think my other son, who's now 14, would not be the kind, generous, caring young man that he is, because I think inevitably I would have been an absent father in many ways, because I would have still been focusing on how other people perceive me and maintaining and sustaining and building this kind of view of myself through the prism of capitalism.
That's powerful. John and I talk a lot, and I talk a lot in different groups about making meaning from crises and grief. And I'm wondering how you applied that, if you did, if you live your life in a way that says, well, this terrible thing happened, but I'm going to make it matter. And so I'm going to apply meaning to it. How did you work through that? Did you come to that? And is that what you do?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I'd love to say I did immediately after Joshua died, but I didn't. I went very much into withdrawal in terms of acceptance of grief. And you know, I do so much work and spend so much time talking to people about grief because of the importance of understanding that this must be something that you allow to pass through you from beginning to end. My view after Joshua died was that, you know, okay, we've had 11 months of this hiatus, and we haven't been able to live our lives. So we kind of got back to, you know, normality, but, you know, there is no normality after the death of a child. And I watched my wife for the next 6 months grieve, and she walked in the mountains with a dog. We just got her new golden retriever at the time, and she really came to terms with it. I figured out that I needed to kind of prove to everybody again that I'm back and I'm empowered again and I'm ready to go. So I built a business, and I built a business in another country, predominantly with stakeholders in other countries again. So I moved into this phase after Joshua's death of 2 years where I was flying like 170, 180 times a year, and pushing my mind and body to extremes, really escaping my grief. And the only time I'd meet my grief would be when I'd be on a plane and we're kind of coming into land or take off. And, you know, they say, take off your headphones and you can't look at your cell phone and all that kind of stuff. And then there'd be a moment where I couldn't be distracted, and I'd get these flashbacks of Joshua's last moments and seeing him die. And then I try and block them out again. And through that 2-year period, my physical health deteriorated massively. I had irritable bowel syndrome. I had leaky gut. I had adult asthma. I had sinusitis. I had chronic headaches. I had chronic fatigue. So many things were going physically wrong with me. And all the way through, I was ignoring the grief. And even at times I went to the hospital because they thought I had heart palpitations and maybe I was having a stroke and all these kind of things. And you know, the physicians were examining everything physically, but nobody was ever really saying to me, you know, has anything like traumatic happened? Has something happened in your life? Nobody paid attention. So it was never brought up. And it was only when I finally had a panic attack in a meeting that I realized I needed to get help, and my wife started to notice it, which was kind of 2 years later. And from then on, there's like a punctuation point where I realized I need to pay attention to myself. And I went into therapy, and then I subsequently trained as a therapist and a coach, and moved out of that world that was, you know, toxic to say the least in terms of my own health. So I see Joshua's death as a punctuation point. It wasn't the immediate moment after he died. You know, the year when he was alive was fantastic because we were all together as a family. And I was so attentive to him, my other son, Luca, and Beatrice, my wife. And then I had a 2-year period where, you know, you go back to your conditioning, you know how to live in the world and behave. But it was always calling me. I mean, Joshua's impact was always saying to me, you know, you need to come back, pay attention to my life, and then pay attention to my death and understand how I came, why I was here, and what learnings there are. And then in the richness of that experience, I was able to understand I need to change.
Wow. So it seems like Joshua gave you a year of being very present, a year of being there and being fully you for that year. Whereas when you weren't in that year, you were the expectations of society in a way. And
100%.
And so how did this whole experience lead you to Buddhism?
So it's kind of funny, but, you know, over the course of my life, I've had so many weird experiences where I've interacted with Buddhism, and probably one of the most profound periods was in my early 20s, where I was waiting for my parents. They'd come over from Ireland. I was in London, and I was in a restaurant waiting for them to arrive from the airport, and their flight got delayed. And sitting behind me was a Zen Buddhist, a monk who was there to meet somebody, and they got delayed, and we ended up talking, and I spent an hour and a half speaking to this guy, and it was an incredible connection that I felt to Buddhism and to him and what he was speaking about, and I think he could see within me that there was probably a little bit more to me than just the sense of how I wanted to be perceived. So I felt that there was a connection there. And then, like, if I look at the serendipity, coincidence, how the universe has interacted with me, there's been multiple times throughout my life where it's connected. And the period post that panic attack and that meeting that led me to believe that I needed to change something brought me to a point of going, okay, I need to go into therapy. And my father had been medicated all the way through his life. He had electric shock treatment in the 80s for anxiety, depression. So I was very clear in my mind, I don't want to go down that path. So I wanted to find an alternative approach. And something in me spoke to this idea that it needs to be with meditation. It needs to be with a sense of connecting to soul and spirit. And I very much kind of been angry at God after Joshua died. And I was brought up as a Catholic in Ireland, and in the leading up to in those 11 months, I used to go to the hospital every day, and I'd pray and say, look, if you can just make this good, I promise I'll be the best Catholic ever, and I'll go to church and I'll do all that kind of stuff. And then of course he died, and I said, well, okay, that's it, the deal's off, it's your fault.
Bargaining phase is over.
Yeah, exactly. I'm taking my cards off the table. I'm out of here. And I realized that there was always a very transactional interaction for me between myself and Christianity, especially the way that I was brought up culturally in Ireland. Whereas, these are all the things that you're doing wrong, and if you can possibly come onto our side of the fence, then maybe we'll accept you. And to be perfectly honest, it's kind of like capitalism in many ways, right? You're kind of really appealing to the audience to say, okay, yeah, you're good enough now, we'll let you in. And when I went into therapy, I knew I needed to find something in terms of my soul. I had a definitely dark night of the soul, and just the days before I started therapy, suicide became a huge clear thought in my mind as an exit, and which is incredible to think about now. I had a beautiful wife, an incredible son, no financial problems, no worries, nothing like that, but I had lost all sense of myself. I was completely untethered, and in a way that we must have a sense of connection to the earth. We must have a sense of a connection to something bigger than us. And if we're lost, then it's paralysis. And I'd felt that, and felt like this was how I needed to end it all. And I found a therapist, and we heard him being interviewed on the radio, and he was a psychiatrist who focuses on therapy and especially PTSD and trauma by bringing in meditation and Eastern practices to it. So this resonated with me so much. And in those final days where I really started to feel like I was completely out of control, I was thankfully able to meet with him, and we sat down and we spoke, and he said to me, if you come in and follow the practices that I set out, and you continue to show up for these sessions, not only will you be better than you are now, but you'll be better than you ever were before, because we're going to create a sense of self, spirit, and a deeper connection to the world. And if there was ever like lines and words that I needed to hear, they were the words. And that just immediately brought me in to say, okay, this is fantastic. And my teacher at the time, my therapist, who then subsequently became my teacher, Dr. Pradeep Chadha was from India, and he's actually a Sufi. So he is not a Buddhist, but he just brought me the sense of something. And then that sense of something then grew into this desire to understand more. And I moved into looking at Hinduism and Buddhism. I looked at Sufism, but I also just needed to find something that I didn't feel there was any kind of great lineage or hang up that I felt I was struggling with within Christianity and Catholicism. And that's when Buddhism started to really settle within me. And I felt, oh, okay, this could be home.
Wow.
Amazing story.
Your journey is so fascinating. And when you're talking about this punctuation point and how lost you were feeling when you finally started paying attention to how you were feeling, you never actually had, from the sounds of it, in your whole life, actually been grounded in who you were, because you were always seeking outside of yourself. And Joshua gave you this beautiful opportunity to pay attention to your own life. So through all of your attention was outward on him, on your wife, on your other son, to make sure they were okay. And then when his presence left this earth, that's when you became lost enough to find yourself.
Yeah. And I think in so many ways, you have to go into the absolute darkness. Mm-hmm. And it's only within that absolute darkness that there's an opportunity to see a shard of light, an opportunity to pull you back out of it. And it was, pay attention, focus on yourself, realize who you are. And to find that sense of, what would it like to just be me? And I kind of jar against this whole idea of, the better version of you, or, your 2.0 version, because I think for like so many people, nobody's actually practiced just being themselves. And it was funny, I was walking with a friend last night, and we'd been out for a walk, and we're with this guy who's a very, very famous actor, and he's a young guy, very successful, but he was just hanging out with us, and we'd gone off for a walk into nature, and we were hanging out for kind of 3 or 4 hours and just shooting the breeze about life, and giving each other space to not feel like you have to be anything. And as we finished the meeting and we finished our walk and we came down, this guy picked up his bike and he was cycling back to where he's staying. And as he was cycling down, he came past us on his bike, and he took his hands off the handlebars and opened his hands up, and he was just kind of, flying down like a kid, feeling the wind in his hands and his arms, and just flapping them and just laughing and enjoying that freedom. And then we saw him see people who recognized who he was, and then they called him, and then he was like holding on and had to pull in. He was like, yeah, hi, da, da, da. And I just remarked to my friend Dave at the time, it's a great example of, there's a moment where he was just really being who he is and just being childlike in terms of his enjoyment of life. And then suddenly people come along and it's like, oh yeah, but remember who you need to be for everybody else. What's the character you want to get in? And he got back into character. And we know how pained he feels in the character, but so many people are struggling to find that sense of being okay with just being who you are.
Right. I love what you said about the 2.0 person. It kind of makes you reel at the idea of it, because if you think about that idea of the 2.0 person, that means you're not living in the present moment. That means you're looking at something that's outside of self that you're trying to get to. And as you and I have discussed before, you only have this moment. This is the only moment you really are experiencing. And if you're not fully here experiencing it, then you can't actually have a life of fulfillment and joy. So all of this stuff that you've been through, and now into Buddhism, how does that play out as a daily practice? How does that play out in how you live your life now?
Yeah, I suppose the evolution of my Buddhism then bizarrely led me to somehow stumble across Yamabushi monks in Japan, who practice an ancient spiritual tradition called Shigendo. So a big part of my recovery was built around nature as well. So nature was so important to me in terms of, I swim in the sea, I walk, I run in the mountains, I live in this beautiful area of nature. And I was in my practice, which was initially very much focused on Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism, I was struggling with nature isn't kind of resonating for me within this. And then somehow I stumbled across the Yamabushi and I started to read about them. And Shigendo is this tradition where Buddhism came to Japan 1500 years ago, and Japan also had Shintoism at the same time. And Shintoism is very much just the focus. It's not even a religion. It's a spiritual practice where we're just connecting to nature and the elements that we live within. And then they brought Buddhism in. So they brought in a lot of the deep teachings of the Buddha, but still maintaining the connection to nature and the sacred nature of the world and the environment and everything that we have around us in order to be in harmony, and also to recognize that, I'm nature, you guys are nature, there's no separation. So that brought me to Yamabushi, and then I contacted them, and I went into a series of exchanges, and we had some video calls, and I got invited to go on master training because I was speaking to them at that stage about my own meditation practice, my journey. So they invited me on master training, and I went out to Japan to undertake my first master training session, and then to become part of Shigendo and Yamabushi. And that was a really enlightening time, because prior to that, I would have been meditating, and I would have had periods of prayer in my day. So every day I would have been have a standard practice. I would wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning. I'd have my meditation. I'd have some prayer, and then I'd go into nature, and I usually swim in the Irish Sea, which is really cold throughout the winter, but it's a really nice way for me to be part of that. And then I went to train with the Yamabushi, and remarkably, one of the first things that I discovered that was important to do was that they go to this waterfall where the water is coming off the top of an ice mountain, and every day has to start with cold water as part of the practice of moving into the connection of self and nature. So it was really weird, because I realized I was already doing what they wanted me to do, and I'd been doing it for nearly 18 months prior to experiencing it in Japan. And that brought me to this sense of, okay, so much of my practice is already where I need to be. And I also started to understand that everything that I needed was already here. And in terms of healing, I really needed to continue on my path. And, when I talked about the physical elements that I had, now, thankfully, as I sit here and speak, I have no physical conditions whatsoever. All of those autoimmune issues had been resolved purely through changing my diet, stopping drinking alcohol, being mindful of what I eat, how I hydrate my body, how I exercise. And it just all stems from the fundamental part of Shigendo, which is the importance of taking care of yourself, putting yourself first, and realizing that, nobody else is coming to save you. It's all up to you. And in master training, we go through this incredibly arduous process over 5 days where we have no food, we're in extreme conditions, we're hiking and trekking, we're disorientated in terms of time. They take your watch, they take your phone, they take everything from you, and you're training under samurai conditions. But the whole focus is to teach you that this is how you need to live life. If you can be first showing up for yourself, then your capacity to be, a father, a brother, a husband, a boyfriend, just a friend of society and the world will be so much more greatly enhanced. And that was a huge part of it. So my spiritual practice, to answer that question in a really long way, is the recognition of the importance to pay attention to me and to put that at the forefront of my day. So I don't see anybody or do any work with anybody else until 11 o'clock in the morning. 5 a.m. to 11 o'clock is just focusing on me, my health, my mind, my meditation, my practices, and then I'm ready.
Wow. You can talk as long as you want, Justin. I can listen to you talk for hours. Right.
Thank you.
I'm fascinated by a lot of it all. How would you say, in other aspects of your life, say in your relationship with your wife and the people in your life, how has your spiritual journey affected those relationships?
Well, there's two parts to that. I think the relationships that are relevant and valuable have deepened. The relationships that were vacuous and irrelevant have ended.
Yep.
Yeah. And especially I suppose the biggest acid test to understand your friendship with people is alcohol. And quitting alcohol 5 years ago, I probably lost 70% of my friends. It was like, well, you don't drink, and of course this is Ireland, so everybody drinks. So it's like massive cultural shock to say that you don't drink alcohol anymore. But it's a great way to move through very quickly who's relevant and important in your life, because people who care about you will not prejudge you based on what you do from a social aspect. And this very much was feeding back into what I spoke about at the start, me living my life wanting to be perceived a certain way by people. So separating myself from the things that are social norms and then seeing who was still there was a beautiful way of understanding, the richness of those relationships that had true value. So I think that the depth of my relationships are far greater. And meditation over a long time, and it's 7 or 8 years now, gives you a greater sense of presence and a capacity to listen and to be there for other people when they need you. So I can see relationships have improved dramatically. I definitely can see that my relationship with my wife, most importantly, has hugely improved, and we have a very deep love. We've been married for 16 years. And that's kind of cornerstone of my life. But it's also, she's also an incredible human being who's been on a spiritual path too, and not that she's practicing Shigendo, but she's a very broad-based sense of spirituality and the fact that there's something bigger than us. And I think women in general have this wonderful affinity to nature. There's just a natural greater connection to nature. I think men, we have to work a little bit harder on it. So she'd already been introducing me to things prior to my own awakening. But I think for us and for our relationship, there's a great strength, but it also brought us to a great realization of the interdependence of our relationship. There's nothing dependent on it. We both recognize too that, there's a great love between us, and there's certainly no sign of anything going wrong, but we're also very separate beings who have separate lives and have separate interests. And again, so much of the pain that people experience in life is a dependency, and it's a dependency on alcohol, it's a dependency on drugs, on sex, on how people perceive us, but it can also be a dependency on being in that relationship and only being defined by your other half. And I've learned through our experience over the last 5 years and my acceptance of myself is that we have to just stand on our own 2 feet. And then those who come and be in relation with us when we're in that space are really powerful, and they bring something fantastic, but we're not defined by the relationship. It brings a richness to our lives.
I agree with that sentiment 100%. As I jokingly say all the time, they call me Triple X because I have 3 of them, right? Right. And it's interesting. You've been married longer than all 3 of my marriages were combined. But what I have come to realize in all of that journey of my own is that a true relationship has to be 2 complete people who choose to walk side by side, enhancing each other's lives, rather than a codependent relationships where one person has to carry the bulk of the weight, because eventually that person will break down. I often say when I'm coaching someone through a relationship situation that, if you really want unconditional love in your life, then you have to be you fully, so that people can see you and love you and not something else. And the biggest lesson I learned in my marriages was that I was giving myself up for their expectations, much like you were with the capitalism, that societal push from the outside. And, and when you're in a loving partner style relationship, it really comes to a place where you can lose yourself for other people's expectations, especially if you're in a relationship with narcissists or people who expect
perceptions of their expectations.
Go ahead, say it again.
You lose yourself in their perception, your perception of their expectations. It might not even be their expectations, but it's your perception of what they expect from you. And so you're trying to show up in that way, and you're falling to pieces because none of it is authentically you.
Right.
It's so beautiful how
it's like preemptive striking. You you want to make sure that you're mitigating it before it happens.
Yeah, to make it 16 years and still have that deep love and commitment and respect for one another, you really do have to be who you are so that they can love that person. Because otherwise they're just loving a mystery and an idea and not who you actually are. So it's so beautiful.
I think it's right, and I think exactly as you said, Tamara. The idea of other people's perceptions are so powerful. I love that expression. We're only limited by the stories that we continue to tell ourselves, and so much of the stories that we can have in a relationship are based on how this other person perceives us. And I'm a firm believer that if a relationship doesn't work, then of course, there's no point in staying in it. But first of all, the exploratory work has to be undertaken. And we came to a point, like 5 years ago, when I stopped drinking alcohol. That was like when I thought, I just had this really clear idea, and I wasn't an alcoholic, but I wasn't happy with alcohol in my life, and it inevitably would lead us to having an argument, right? Alcohol was definitely a stimulant in that regard. And as we evolved our relationship, when we ended alcohol, I really wanted us to check in with each other. And we moved through this idea of having like a monthly podcast where like we weren't recording it. It was just the two of us, but you'd sit down, not a date night, it was an hour where you'd sit at the table and you'd come to the table with your questions, and you'd be, accepting that the other person is going to come to the table with questions as well. And it was an open, fluid engagement. And a big part of that was, especially for me, I mean, my wife, she, I think definitely probably was a Zen Buddhist monk in a former life. I was the one who was kind of neurotic about, well, what did she think about this? And what did she think about that? And what did she think about this? So when you start to then ask the questions, instead of having them in your head and getting limited by that story that's in your head, and you actually just sit down and say, when this happened recently, I think you felt I was doing X or Y. It gives the opportunity to out it. And more often than not, the person's going, wasn't even thinking about it.
Right. I love that. I love that because of, it's interesting is what you've set up is open and clear communication. Yeah. And I often tell people, you can never know what someone else is really thinking. I don't care how close you are until you ask them and they tell you, because they could have been on something entirely different and your perception could be skewed.
Yeah.
I know a lot of very gifted psychics, and I do that with quotes because I know some who are not gifted psychics, right? And the ones I know who are truly gifted, I find that oftentimes they're the most fragile, because they come to that space of, they have these gifts and they get this information, but they also go to that place of expecting themselves to know. And a lot of times they get their own ego issue because they've been accurate in the past, and now everything they think must be accurate. And so it ends up becoming a detriment to their life experience. The open communication you created with your wife is amazing. As I said, it should be about enhancing each other's lives, and you can't enhance each other's lives unless you check in and know what's going on with their life, right? I mean, it's really pretty simple, really, if you think about it.
It is, but when I look at this, and if I'm looking at this in terms of my interaction from a work context, and I say to people all the time, like, everything in life that goes wrong is a breakdown in communication. Very few things don't fall outside a breakdown in communication. Whether it's a tragedy with the space shuttle, or a relationship breakdown, or Enron failing. When you pick all these things apart, you get to see a continuous theme where people had a perception around what everybody else was thinking, but nobody actually spoke to what was actually happening. Mm-hmm. And we have to have that level of dialogue and communication, and it transfers from your own relationship into your kids as well, because we are the bastions of relationship development for our children, right? They're going to learn from us. Now, thankfully, they can unlearn some of the bad stuff that we inherited, and we've all inherited bad stuff from our own parents. But we have an opportunity to nourish and nurture a positive understanding in terms of effective communication. And I think, for me, spirituality speaks to the openness of communication in a family unit. And if they can see that the parents have that sense of communication, then it might mean that you catch that moment where your kids, especially as they become teenagers, feel okay to also speak up when there's something going on, because they can see their parents are okay with being vulnerable. And quite often, if we hold back and we try and keep ourselves tough and strong, then the transfer of energy is that the children feel like that's all they can do. So there's no safety in that home environment. And this is spirituality transferring into so many other ways, rather than just a sense of self. Confidence in yourself and security allows you to be vulnerable, and that allowing of vulnerability allows other people to feel comfortable to come forward and be vulnerable with you.
That's so beautiful. I'm always saying that parenting is show, not tell. We can tell them anything we want, but that doesn't mean they're going to hear a single word we say. But we are always showing them how we do life, and that's what they're learning.
Yeah. As soon as you tell them, they're not listening.
Yeah,
right.
We're showing them, and then they'll show it back. And I always tell parents, we're planting seeds. That's what we're doing. We're just gardeners of the soul. We're not going to necessarily see it, but sometimes we do. Sometimes it's glimpses of those seeds that we've planted and nurtured with love and light. And all of a sudden, I'll see I have 2 teenagers and one who's nearly there. I'll see it in them, and I'll say, oh, they're getting it. They're absorbing it. And they'll come back to me. And, I have a 16-year-old daughter who said to me, maybe I trust you too much, Mom, because you're the only person I can tell all of these things to. And I was like, no, honey, we're getting it right.
Right.
We're getting it right. This is okay.
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Justin. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, I had a call today with a client who's a finance director of a company, and very successful career and all that kind of stuff. But in the midst of our conversation, he was struggling, and he had just come back from vacation. His daughter is 15, and he was really struggling with that relationship. So we kind of broke it down and we're talking about it. And he was struggling because he was, there was anger coming up within him, and the anger was getting vented towards his daughter. And then when we kind of went into the lead up to this, she's just kind of drifting and, can you do this? Could you, go down to the store and get me this thing? And then I need it by 2:00, and she's already just leaving at 2:00. So frustration because they're not paying attention. And there was 2 parts to it. One was I was explaining to him that, teenagers in a developmental brain perspective, the neuroscience of what we understand now is that they actually evolve a separation mechanism from their parents. So they actually have to create a level of disdain towards parents because they've realized that they're going to survive past their parents. So human biology says find a new tribe. So they have to separate. So they will push your buttons in order to separate. And if you can notice that, then you can also go, not really being as bad as I perceive them to be. They're just actually following the human evolution path. And I explained it to him and he was like, okay, I get that. And I said to him, let's talk about the possibility of loss here, though. If you look at, for me, things are a breakdown in communication or a sense of loss. And I said to him, how do you feel in terms of loss? And he said, well, I don't know what you mean. And I said, well, your child is separating, how does that feel? And that's where it really hit him emotionally. And he started to cry, which again is something that men need to learn to do more. And he was able to recognize that there was grief here, that he needed to find the space to understand and process the grief, because 18 months ago, he was top of the tree. My dad is the best thing ever. And all of a sudden, he's this annoying person who's getting in my way. And there's a loss and a sense of grief within that. And again, that's a spiritual connection to understanding the nature and the resonance of family and not trying to push against it. We have to allow the flow of natural life just to move forward. And if we allow it to flow, we can move with it. If we try and hold it back, it doesn't work. It's just pain.
They keep growing no matter what.
So I agree with everything you just said. I want to ask you an interesting question about parenting. The question I want to ask is being a Buddhist and being someone who believes in reincarnation, do you believe that you should treat them as children, or like using baby talk and all that, or do you believe you should treat them as humans or like adults with without the skills or the knowledge? So, to give you an example, when my son was born, we taught him sign language long before he could ever speak, and he would ask to breastfeed, and he would do all those things and be very clear, and it became very clear very quickly that his knowledge was much broader than what his body was possessing. And so, to give an example, we were at a restaurant one time and he saw something on the other side of the table he wanted, and he went, he started screaming for it, trying to reach for it. And my wife at the time, she literally reached over and she put her knuckle in his mouth and stopped him from yelling. And she gave him the new gesture of want. And he looked at her, he looked at it, and she gave it to him. He had the sign in a second. And so to me, we took the practice of, let's treat him as a person who doesn't have the skills or the knowledge, rather than doing the baby talk. So what's your perspective on that sort of parenting?
Yeah, I think it's really powerful. I think it's really important that we meet them wherever they are. So I think, slightly controversially in terms of talking about reincarnation, but the sense
not here, buddy, not here.
No, I know. Okay, we're in a safe space, right? the sense of each individual being so different. When we look at that through the prism of reincarnation, it's the evolution of the soul. So you could have two kids, and one of them, has come through many other lessons, and they're a more evolved soul. And when they arrive into the world, their capacity to understand and process information just happens in a much easier way. And I can reflect on that, looking at my own siblings, but we see this across the board in society. So I think it's beautiful to have sign language with children and toddlers. And I think what we have to be able to understand is that these are beings who want to be included and who have this immense capacity to learn and to absorb information. But meeting them where they are also inhibits or prohibits the unnecessary frustration that I think some parents can then lean too far into that, where there's an expectation then that, you know, well, look, my little Johnny is not kind of as developed as Timmy down the road because I can see him doing so much more. So we have to move into it, but allow the child to flourish. You know, if we give them space, and of course they still need boundaries in terms of understanding, you know, how to navigate the world. But I think from an evolutionary standpoint, it's to give them that space and understand what's best for them, but also minding yourself and all of that. Because if you get caught into how I want my kid to be, well, you know, there's a transfer of power, and attached to that is a huge amount of pain.
Wow. My son, we put him in a Waldorf school when he was very young. And I don't know if you know about Waldorf schools at all.
Yeah, they're fantastic.
One of the things about Waldorf schools is that they let a child learn to read when they have interest in reading. And so a lot of times that means that Waldorf children are less developed in knowing their alphabet younger and all of those things. And when you compare them to other kids from other schools, they are way behind. But by the time they get to 9th grade, the Waldorf kids are at a 12th grade level. And you take those kids and you put them in a regular high school in 10th grade, and they're like, oh, you guys are just learning this? Because it's like we learned that 2 years ago in Waldorf, right? So it was literally meeting the child where they were and letting them come through to their experience themselves, which I thought was, when I was going through it, I got to tell you, being the parent of the kid who wasn't as advanced as the neighbor down the street was, you know, pretty tough. It was like, oh, what do you mean this? And then you start to doubt yourself. Is this Waldorf thing actually good for my child, right? And so you had to have that perspective of, is this good for him, or is this my ego having an issue? Because, you know, and so it became a very interesting struggle in that regard. I love your perspective on it. Tamara, do you have any perspective on any
I
of
have
that?
so many perspectives on parenting. So. And I totally agree that we have to meet each individual child where they are at. They're all different. And what helps me so much is remembering that they're on their own journey. They came into this life for their own reasons, and I'm their guide. They chose me. This is how I believe. They chose me as their guide for whatever reasons they chose. I feel like reincarnation-wise, we've traveled before together. And, you know, this time around, I have the honor and the privilege to be their guide and the responsibility of making sure I clean up my own stuff so that they can come through as clean as possible into their adult lives. And I love what you said about, because I think parents don't realize that in these early teen years, there's very much this, I have to, just like toddlers, right? Teens and toddlers are so alike. I have to break away from my parent because I'm really realizing I am my own individual person. And in a few years, I'm going to leave. I'm going to be grown up and go away. And so the child is creating purposeful rifts to allow themselves to separate from that trusted parent and guide. And the parent at the same time, as you said, your friend didn't even realize his own grief at the thought of the loss of that child in his everyday experience. But when we as parents work on being mindful and present in our own daily lives, we give the gift of that to our kids too. Because I don't honestly love every moment of parenting. That is
Nobody does.
But I have loved every age and stage, and I've never wanted to cling to that. Or, you know, you hear parents say, oh, if they would only stay little. Well, you would get tired of that after a while. We want them to grow and evolve because they're such interesting human beings when we let them be who they are and show us without our expectations of how we thought children would be in our lives and who they're supposed to be and how we want them to live. They get to be who they are. And it's our job to just be that sturdy, safe reinforcement for them.
I had an interesting parent experience just recently. My son lives with me half the time, lives with my ex half the time. So we have, he comes here like on Thursday and he's here till Monday, and then he goes back to her. And there was this week where she was going to be away. And I said, well, kind of, if you just want to stay, that's fine. He says, no, I want to go home. I go, well, why? He says, because I want to be alone. I said, so you want to go home because she's not there? He says, yeah, and I want to go home because you're here. He wanted his independent time to be on his own. And I applaud him for that. I will admit 100% it gave me a little twinge of, my kid wants to get away from me. But I completely accepted that that's him expressing, who he is and his desires at that time, and knowing the need of being alone.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. And I think it's great as well, John, that you're able to, feel the pain, but still recognize that, it's a transition period. And I think if we create that space, I went on to study a master's in mindfulness-based stress reduction and performance. So understanding the neuroscience of how mindfulness can enhance our lifestyles. And my son has experienced over the years, my approach to meditation and mindfulness, and he's brought that into his sporting life, where he's a goalkeeper in soccer, and he plays at a really high level. But before every game, he now spends 10 minutes when we're driving there, where he just slows down, closes his eyes, goes into his breath. And if you're a goalkeeper, to be a parent of a goalkeeper is pretty horrible, because he's the kid who, once he makes a mistake on the field, it's disastrous, right? Everybody else can make mistakes and somebody else can kind of back you up. But I see that transferring into so many other areas of his life. Like we're plant-based at home, and he will identify as a vegetarian. Predominantly he's vegan, but he's in a school of 800 kids and he's the only one who is vegetarian. And he's happy to be that way, and he doesn't mind the fact that he's different, but he's keeps his balance. He plays his sport. He understands that it's okay to be different, and I don't need to be in the crowd. I don't need to follow the group. So from an evolutionary standpoint, when I look at this 14-year-old kid, his knowledge in terms of how he navigates the world, was far greater than mine was by the time I was 30. So these beings that we have an opportunity to just be part of their teaching, we're just being given this time to be with them and to help them evolve a little bit. But so much of what's going to happen, I think they've already brought in. I'll tell you guys something that is kind of astounding, and I wouldn't normally share on a podcast, but we're here, so this is the perfect opportunity. But when Luca, my 14-year-old, he was 4 when Joshua died, and the day that Joshua died, we'd actually taken him out of hospital, and we're allowed to have him at home with us for 3 weeks to allow him to be in palliative care with us. So my parents had come over. We're still stuck in Spain at this stage, and my parents came over to help out. And the night before, Joshua had kind of 6 or 7 cardiac arrests, and we thought he was going to die, but he didn't. He stayed alive. So we got to take him into our bed that night, and he slept between myself and my wife. And then the next morning, we knew that he was really at the end. Like, his breathing was really labored. We were administering morphine patches to deal with his pain. So he was coming to the end. So we got my parents to bring Luca out to the beach, so he wasn't there to witness that final thing at 4. And then Joshua died, and we had the undertakers come and take him from the house. So we kind of like talking about how do we parent this moment, and we said, well, let's not have Luca know that Joshua died in the house, because we didn't really know how he was going to manage that as a 4-year-old. So we thought, well, tomorrow, we'll just say today, because we were pretty traumatized at this moment, we'll just say today that Joshua's gone back into hospital, which would have been a normal thing. And tomorrow we'll let him know that, he's died in hospital, and that way we can bring him through it all. So we decided, okay, that's what we do. And Luca came back, and we said Joshua's gone back to hospital, and then we went to bed that night, and the funniest, weirdest thing happened. So as we went to bed that night, my wife went in to put Luca into bed, and she kissed him goodnight, and then she came into the bed beside me, and she said, go in and give Luca a kiss goodnight, and just tell me if you think there's anything strange about him when you're in there. And I was like, oh, okay. So I went in and tucked him in and went down to give him a kiss goodnight. And Joshua was tube fed. He was oxygen dependent. So he had like a very distinctive taste and smell from his skin and his face. I went down to kiss Luca, and I immediately just met this smell and taste as if Joshua was there. It was like overpowering, and it was really shocking. And I kissed him, and I thought, is that what she meant? And I went back in, and I said to her, did you smell and taste Joshua off Luca? And she said, yeah, that's what I meant. And I was like, that's just unbelievable. So we were both kind of like overwhelmed by that. And the next morning, so Luca has no idea that Joshua's died. And the next morning we wake up, and Luca's at the end of the bed as a 4-year-old, and he's standing there, and he's yabbering on something at the end of the bed, and we're kind of waking up looking at him. And he said, oh, yeah, he said, baby Joshua made the sun come up this morning. And we said, what do you mean he made the sun come up this morning? And he said, yeah, he made the sun come up this morning. I was looking out my window, and I saw his face going up into the sky, and then I saw his face up by the sun, and then he disappeared. And we just did not know what to say.
Goosebumps! Holy smokes! Goosebumps!
yeah. It was really the most incredible experience of my life. And so much of what I've seen then within Luca, I've had such great strength, because I always feel that the spirit of his brother has become such an important part of him, and it still has. I mean, Luca's incredibly impacted by it, and a very emotionally intelligent, because he had a great understanding of loss and death at a very young age. But yeah, it's the kind of story that somebody would have told me, and I'd be like, yeah, of course. And then I experienced it, and it was like, wow, God, like we have no idea what's going on in any sense of reality that we believe in.
There are more things in heaven and earth that are dreamt of in our philosophy. Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, we have gone a full hour, which is amazing.
That's a record for Spirit Cafe.
It is a record. And Justin, it is such a privilege to have you on here. I love hearing your perspective on things. I love hearing about your journey and the things that you're going through and the things you believe now. And thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, guys. It's been a real pleasure.
Beautifully with us. We appreciate you sharing those very personal moments. Thank you.
Tamara, you want to take us out of this thing, and then Justin, we'll talk to you as soon as we close this thing out.
Yeah.
All right. Ooh, the big finish. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, John. Thank you, listeners, for being here. And hopefully you allowed yourself to feel through this episode, because I always say, when we feel it, we heal it. But if we ignore it, we store it. And as you heard in Justin's story, it has health implications. So we want to always allow those feelings to come through us so that we can continue to grow through our lives and experience more fully what we came here to experience. So thank you, thank you, thank you. We'd love to hear your comments and feedback, and share this episode with someone who you know needs it. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us at Spirit Cafe, a place where you can safely explore your spirituality without the guilt or dogma of religion. Leave all comments and suggestions on the Spirit Cafe podcast Facebook page.